Hello, I'm Mark Baker, founder of Origin Live. I'm here to talk about how to get the best performance out of your cartridge. Now, many of you have probably had your cartridge and tone arm set up by your dealer, and they will have put on the correct tracking force. They've used the right tools and so on to set it up correctly in terms of its geometry and so on. And we also do this for people. And what we always say at the end, after we've done everything, is that the client must tune things in by ear to get the optimum performance. It's not apparently something that most dealers actually tell their customer for one reason or another, but we do, because we know it's really important. And there are two reasons for this. The first is that the cartridge actually changes over the first 40 hours of running. In other words, the suspensions just sag a tiny little bit more on some cartridges than others. And in fact, most cartridge manufacturers recommend that you start by running in your cartridge at a slightly heavier than average tracking force. That's the average specified by the manufacturer, of course, because the suspension just is a little bit too springy at that stage, and it tends to bed in over time. And then after 40 hours, revisit the whole thing and tune everything in for kind of the next year or something. Okay, the second reason, which may surprise many of you, is that cartridges are made with slight variations. And this is not in any way a criticism of cartridge manufacturers, because I have the highest respect for these guys. I mean, they are dealing with impossible tolerances and they build things with such precision. But nevertheless, even with all the best tools, you are still going to get slight variations. And because these delicate little instruments are so sensitive, you will hear the slight differences. In fact, the top high-end cartridge manufacturers say that no two cartridges ever sound completely alike, but I wouldn't get worried that you're going to get a Duff cartridge, because that won't be the case. It's just that there are slight differences in the sound they produce. Right, well, we want to look now at how to actually set up the cartridge by ear. And just a few little tips before we get started on this. The first is that when you're going to be doing a lot of listening tests, so it's helpful to listen to music you know well, music you enjoy and are familiar with, because otherwise it'll be very tedious. And use maybe 2 or 3 chosen records for this job. Use average records. In other words, if you use a supercut record or a 180 gram record, because they're a millimetre thicker than every other record, it's going to put your measurements out a bit, and you want to try and have an average setting for this job, really. The other tip is to use a flat record. It just helps the reliability of your results, really, to do that. Okay, well, before getting going on what we listen for when we're changing the various parameters on the tone arm, I'd better go through some of the basic adjustments so that those of you who haven't done this sort of thing before will understand what we're on about. So let's look at the first thing which we're going to vary, and that is the tracking force on the cartridge. Tracking force is simply the downward pressure that the stylus is exerting on the record. You can measure it, because sometimes dials and all the rest springs aren't that accurate, believe it or not. So if you want to really check and get it accurate, get a stylus force gauge and simply measure the downward force. In terms of adjusting your tracking force, you can refer to your tone arm manual, because that will explain exactly how to change the tracking force. On most arms it's done by the counterweight, either kind of moving in one direction or another. A lot of arms have springs on the side of the yoke which can also adjust your tracking force. Doesn't really matter what the method is. The important thing at the moment is that you know how to change it. The next adjustment is the VTA, the vertical tracking angle of the cantilever in relation to the record. Okay, you don't actually need to know what the VTA figure is, because the cartridge manufacturer has designed the VTA to be at its optimum when the arm is level with the record, okay? So if we raise or lower the rear end of the arm, it'll alter the tracking angle of the cantilever by, say, if you raise it, say, a mil, it'll alter it maybe 1/4 degree or something. I don't know. Okay, so that's what we're going to do to alter your VTA. And lastly, we come to side bias. And side bias, again, is different on all arms. Our arm uses a falling ball and thread method, which is going to put an adjustable side force onto the arm. Now, the reason for side bias, I better just say, and we normally I set it roughly in the middle of the record, but again, that can vary. Some people, it's a compromise wherever you put it. But there is a tendency with all arms which have overhang, which is 95% of all arms on the market, for the arm to want to swing inwards when it's playing on the record. That's just the force that the record grooves are exerting. You might think centrifugal force is throwing it out, but no, that's wrong. It pulls inwards. So to compensate for that, what the arm has is side bias, which exerts a very gentle sort of tug in the opposite direction, and that has the advantage of basically enabling the stylus to sit without a side force in the grooves. It should theoretically be able to just glide straight down rather than being sort of tugged slightly to one side all the time, which is obviously detrimental to your music and is clearly audible as well, by the way. So that gets the basics out of the way. We can now move on to talking about what you're going to listen for when you're tuning in these variables. And if we start with tracking force, because I like to start with tracking force, there are reasons behind that which I won't go into now, but start with maybe increasing the tracking force by 0.1 of a gram. What you'll probably notice is that the music starts to sound a little bit heavier, a little bit more ploddy, and sometimes that may be an improvement, but again, you're going to judge this for yourself. And you'll probably notice things, by the way, that I won't mention necessarily in these descriptions, but we're after the best sound. So whatever sounds best is best, okay? And again, use your different records to make sure you've got the happy average. Okay, now if the tracking force is a bit on the light side, then what you'll probably notice is a feeling of insecurity in the music. You may also get some distortion, and the solidity, I think it mainly in terms of the solidity of notes isn't the same. It isn't as good as you know it can be. So that gives some idea on what you're listening to for tracking force. But you get your optimum tracking force where you think the music sounds best, and now we move on to the VTA adjustment. Okay, so let's do that. With VTA adjustment, what you're mainly going to hear differences in is the tonal balance of the music. Some people aren't particularly sensitive to tonal balance, in which case they're probably the people who think VTA adjustment doesn't make a lot of difference. But I personally am very sensitive to tonal balance, and it stands out to me a mile off when something's not tuned in correctly. So what I'll normally do is it doesn't matter, I start raising or lower, but raise the rear end of the arm maybe 1 millimeter, and I'll listen to the music. Generally, what you'll expect to hear is an increase in the top end. In other words, the treble will become more prominent, and the opposite will be true of the bass. That'll tend to fade away a little bit. So you make a judgment, is this preferable or not? If it isn't, then try going lower if we're standing 1 mil high, maybe go down 2 mil, so you're 1 mil low now, and listen to the music. What you'll notice there is the treble probably will have dulled off a bit, and the music will have become more bass oriented. There'll be more warmth and weight in the system, plus it'll go deeper. Right, so again, you just listen to that, and once you've arrived at your what you feel is the best VTA adjustment, then you stop there and we go back to the tracking force, because these two are completely interrelated. In other words, if you increase the tracking force, it actually alters the angle of the cantilever because it tends to sag a little bit under the weight. Okay, only a tiny bit, but it's enough. So you need to then change the VTA adjustment so that the stylus profile is still vertical. That's the thinking behind it. So that's why we need to revisit the tracking force. So let's listen in through the tracking force again, go through the routine that I went over first. And if it's not changed from your first preference, then you're home and dry. That's it. Job done. You can start enjoying the music and that's it, fine. But if you find that your preference for the tracking force has changed, oh, and by the way, it's a good idea to just note down your tracking force each time you do this, because you might forget what it was before or something. So make a note each time. But anyway, if it's changed, then set it to your new preference and revisit the VTA adjustment, because that again will have changed. So you change your VTA adjustment. You keep going like this, and it probably won't take that long, by the way. It's not as if you're going to do 10 of these things, but you just keep going till those two figures don't change. And at that point, again, you're home and dry and finished. We just got the side bias to go. So what are we listening for now on the side bias? I normally use a track roughly halfway along the record to listen to side bias. And it's going to be a compromise wherever you put it, by the way. So there is no right or wrong on this. And I'll listen to the music. What I notice is that the music will snap into focus when the side bias is right. You'll vary it backwards and forwards over a preferred sweet spot. But when you are on the sweet spot for the side bias, what you'll notice is that the music has great separation. The image isn't kind of a bit vague, and things are just much more stable. It's like adjusting the lens of a camera, really, and noticing the focus suddenly come in. That's what you're going to hear. Right, well, I hope that's been helpful, and that you'll enjoy listening to these variations for yourself. So before concluding this video, I'd like to talk about a very important area, and one which is of interest as well, in terms of enabling you to judge what's probably a good arm and what probably isn't. You'll notice in the marketplace that there are quite a number of arms with kind of rear ends that look like Christmas trees. They're full of fancy dials and calibrations, levers, springs, all of this sort of stuff, okay? And they look deeply impressive. They're well engineered, and you could think, wow, this is fantastic. I can set up my azimuth in 5 seconds flat. Dealers and reviewers will love it. Well, they do love it because it makes life so easy for them. I mean, it's tedious at the best of times to set up your arm and cartridge, so anything that makes life easier has got to be a bonus, or has it? Because our view is that most owners actually only really change their settings about every 3 years when they change the cartridge. So, if that's you, do you really want all of this when for a little bit of extra, 10 minutes extra pain in setting up the counterweight, for instance, you can enjoy a much higher level of sound quality. And the drawback with this, as we're going to get onto a little bit later, the drawback is that it introduces spurious vibration, which, when we're talking about something as sensitive as your cartridge, which is amplifying any vibration 8,000 times, yeah, it does matter. 8,000 times is unimaginable, and it's clearly audible. People have disbelieved this. I mean, but just to relate a couple of examples, we've dealt a lot with the Rieger arms because we modify them, and there have been Rieger owners who have had this is the RB250, but the RB300 has a spring dial to adjust the tracking force in this section of the arm just here. And people have ripped out that spring dial and then used the counterweight alone to set the tracking force. Because you can do that, you just put a Stiles force gauge on the end and that's it. That alone has made a really audible and significant difference to the RB300. That's not something we recommend, by the way, because it does devalue the arm in terms of its second-hand sale value, and also it invalidates the warranty. So please don't go doing it. There is a balance on everything. But it's the same again with with this little fella here, which adjusts the side bias on the Riga arm. There's a little magnet in there, and of course it rattles around in micro vibration very slightly. It rattles around, clearly audible. We've had people who have ripped that out and said yes, it makes a significant difference. Probably not. Vibration isn't the only reason, by the way, because actually magnets tend to damp the movement slightly as well. So there may be something going on there, but I wouldn't like to be hard and fast on that one. Just while we're on the subject of Riga arms, it may be interesting to note that before we got into making our own tone arms, we used to modify a lot of Rigas, and one of the things that we did was replace the rear end stub. Now you might question why could that possibly make any difference? And it's another example of this easy of adjustment. Adjustments are really important in designing a real super arm that sounds fantastic. But many arms have a rotating counterweight to increase your tracking force, because it's a very easy calibration. One turn of this counterweight is 1 gram, so 1.5 turns is 1.5 grams tracking force. Dead easy, lovely adjustment, you might think. However, we got rid of this business and went to clamping the counterweight onto the rear stub using a grub screw and mechanical fastening. That alone won't actually do anything normally. So if you've got an RB300 with a steel counterweight, steel rear stub, it's not going to do anything for it. It's more involved than that. We actually replace the rear stub itself. If you don't think that really makes a difference, then it might be helpful just to go through a few reviews of what the press thought about this, because although we're going back now probably about 10 years, maybe 15 in some of the cases, it doesn't make these modifications any less true. And our reputation was really built on modifying the Riga arm in the early days. And it's no less true now than it was then. Of course, it's old news now, so people aren't, the press isn't that interested. But this is what they had to say then, and this is it. It's Hi-Fi World wrote this. It has all this about the modified Riga. It has all the dynamic power and seismic base of a £2,000 super arm, but costs a fraction to buy. I have to say, the Riga upgrades, that's the Origin Live upgrades to the Riga, turn this humble arm into a real giant killer. Gone is the rather grey, sterile sound of the cooking Riga. Instead, tonal colour is fresh, dynamics have great speed and impact, and the soundstage is huge. Stereo Times wrote this: the overall musical and sonic performance of the Origin Live RB250 is simply astounding. Considering its sub $500 price, which is sort of £350, the only appropriate reaction is to yell Eureka. The Origin Live upgrade of the RB250 appears to be the new giant killer. And then TNT Audio wrote this: if you have any Riga RB250 or 300, dismount the arm and send it off for the mods now, in capital letters. You have no idea what you are missing. What Hi-Fi gave our structural upgrade, that's the rear counterweight upgrade, a 5-star rating. But, well, I'm sure you've gathered from those reviews that our arms and modifications are a bit special. So if you'd like to know more, please go to our website at www.originlive.com. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please give us a like on YouTube, and we look forward to hearing from you maybe in the future.